But I was trying. Good morning. Professor Bob has insisted that I mention that the program will start up at 2 o'clock this afternoon with Angela Massey. She is another Bobcat out of the School of Media Arts and Studies, and she is with the Weather Channel, so we look forward to that one. I have the pleasure to introduce our next guest, but before I do that, I'm going to ask you to play along with me for a moment. Pocket your cell phone. Close your laptop. Close your eyes. I'm waiting. I'm going to ask you to observe a moment of silence. Relax. Feel your feet on the ground. Pay attention to your breathing or your chewing. Pay attention to this moment. Become present. Thank you. I'm trying to channel a Viscom alum, Cheryl Hatch. She's a photojournalist, international journalist, teacher extraordinaire, and former housemate to our next speaker. She begins each of her classes with a moment of meditation to help clear the mind. Come into focus on the moment. I'm going to borrow her technique so that you don't miss what our next speaker will offer. It is important. There are those that think photojournalists are heartless, vultures, hardened to the suffering they see, only interested in their next bit of fame. There are others that think that the only really good work done in this industry is at the really big newspapers. Our next presenter shatters both of those perceptions. Richard Tsong-Taatarii is a staff photojournalist for the Minneapolis Tribune. He's a graduate of the School of Visual Communication, and he's made a career of telling stories with a particular passion for photographing marginalized communities. Some of those include coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement, Rohingya exodus, Native American issues. Those of us who know Richard marvel at his genius, his deep passion for the people whose stories he tells, and this form of photography. The beauty and power of his work has been lauded by many, including World Press, the Pictures of the Year International Competition, and last year, the National Press Photography Association named Richard the top international photojournalist of the year. In a moment, Richard will show you some of those images. Yet what I think is most important to see is beyond those images. Be present, experience this person. He embodies what is good about this field. He's a shining example of an alumni and the kind of person this industry needs, and so does our society. Cheryl says he has a big heart. Look for that. Please give a big welcome to Richard.
Can you hear me? Does it work? Okay. Oh, with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation. Now, I'm so honored to be back at OU, and I last left campus in '99, and like many students of the era, I did not turn in my thesis, and because I had an internship, I had a job, and sort of put it on my back burner. But then I realized, I did not take the final step in setting a bad example. So I finally finished my thesis 3 years ago or something, and with a big gap. But thanks to the mercy of Terry Eiler and the Viscom department, I was able to graduate. So I'm not sure it's feeding. Oh, okay, now it is. So, I was fortunate enough to start out, with a staff job right after college. after an internship. And, for a few years, I worked really hard and found stories and did stories. And then I got sidetracked into shooting weddings. So I just sort of did, I thought I did my job well at work, but, my extra time was not focused on telling stories that were important. But so this brings me back to OU. So 5-6 years ago, I thought about finishing my degree, and I thought, here's a project that I could do and submit, and also speaks to my interests. I'm an immigrant. I came here at the age of 10, and like our previous speaker, I've always thought about my place and identity in this culture. And, as an immigrant, sometimes you feel like you're not in understanding the culture you are growing up in as best as others. But as you grow up, you realize sometimes it's an advantage, because as the other or an outsider, you can take a different perspective and use that perspective to tell, another point of view that's important and add to the voices that are out there. So this project, I'm going to show two projects, one from the Lakota diaspora in North and South Dakota, and also the part of a Rohingya exodus, some still images from that. So I decided to head to Pine Ridge, which is one of the poorest places in the United States. It's a reservation in South Dakota. And I know a lot of people have been there and shot pictures, but a lot of times journalists go there and don't spend a lot of time there. And I sort of went there, took time off from work, or like time that was owed to me, and I just went out there for like 9-10 days at a time and try to meet people. And one of the key things I knew I had to do was to meet a medicine man who could introduce me to the cultural things that were happening on the reservation, because the Pine Ridge had a reputation for its poverty, the alcoholism, and all the things wrong that were going there. But I also knew that there were powerful things going on there, a kind of cultural revival. So this is like a sun dance the night before under the stars. This is where people gather to pay homage to the Creator the next day, and they dance around a sacred tree. And what happens is they tie themselves with hooks to the tree, and then they keep dancing until the hooks tear out. And it's a powerful ritual. And in this image, you can see that the people there are very complicated, unlike the stereotypes we sometimes have of Native Americans. They have different signs of identity, They're baseball fans, they're fans of the culture at large, but they also have their deep ties to their culture, and which is technically outlawed, sun dances, till the Religious Freedom Act in the 70s, I believe. And it's just a different worldview there, where nature plays a really powerful role in your daily life. So this is at the Wounded Knee Massacre Cemetery, where tribal chiefs' sons had gathered, and there was a piece of land right next to the Wounded Knee Massacre, which was a trading post, and the tribe had wanted to get this land back into tribal ownership, but the owner, who was a Caucasian, didn't want to sell it unless it was for a high price. So they were kind of protesting, and so these horses ran by, and this was seen as an auspicious sign that things might turn out for the better. So regardless whether you believe this is true or not, this is their worldview, and it shapes the way they see the world. This is a crazy horse ride where they honor probably one of the greatest Lakota warriors who, took on Custer at Standing Rock. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So this is a 4-day ride from Fort Robinson, where he was killed, back to Pine Ridge. And it's quite an event. It usually happens early in the summer. So this is one of the rites of passage that I was able to photograph. These are young men. There's a high rate of suicide on the reservation, and one of the ways to battle that is to give kids and young girls a sense of identity. So they go through this camp where they learn traditional arts like, bow hunting, and they're given a medicine bag and some sweetgrass, and just lessons about their ancestors. So they just come out of a sweat. And there are systemic issues on the reservation, like, food, malnutrition, and also neglect because her mother had issues with alcohol. And so some of the revival things were to bring back the harvesting of buffalo. At one point there were millions of buffalo roaming across the United States, the plains, but now they're raised in pens and harvested for food, and all parts are used for traditional medicine or rituals, religious rituals. And this is like a skinning of a buffalo that might have happened 150 years ago. It was done with a knife and not much else. And it was usually done by women too, as you can see in this case. And you can see the loneliness of the landscape. It's a country funeral of a woman who died from cirrhosis of the liver at the age of 52, which is the average lifespan of a woman on Pine Ridge, actually, at the time. This got shut down. This is in a neighboring town right across the border in Nebraska, where there were 4 liquor stores selling malt liquor, like 5 million cans a year to the mostly natives who, some of them had an addiction issue because of the alcohol. And this happened to be on one of the building fronts, and I like the play of contradictions. You have a Native American helping a settler, and in this case, the Native Americans are struggling. So why did I show all these pictures from Pine Ridge? So I followed that project for 3 years. It was kind of a passion project, and it was the subject of my thesis. And when I heard about the Standing Rock protests, something clicked in me and said, the people of Standing Rock and Pine Ridge have a strong relationship. They're both Lakotas. And a lot of people from Pine Ridge went up to Standing Rock to support the protest. So I felt I needed to go up there and see what was going on. And these are young folks from Standing Rock at the camp there. And what was interesting is there was a lot of humor while they were playing these. They weren't like drumming quote-unquote war songs. They were actually courting songs and dating songs, and they were very, very funny. So this is on the Standing Rock Reservation where, the reason it was so important for them, the people there, to take a stand was there was this pipeline going under the Missouri, and it would carry so much oil, but if there was a rupture, the only water source for the reservation would be polluted. So you couldn't drink the water, like you couldn't make formula and give it to your young child. Children that play in one of the tributaries that feeds into the Missouri. So when I was photographing what was going on too, I was trying to capture things that water embodied, play, the sense of attachment to nature. And a lot of Native Americans came from all over the United States. This woman, who's part Native American, came from Chicago. And I took her portrait with a torn copy of the Laramie Treaty, which had at one point guaranteed the Lakotas vast territories in North-South Dakota and surrounding areas, water rights, hunting rights, and habitation rights. And of course, because of the discovery of gold, these treaties were either ignored or superseded. This gentleman came from Wisconsin. This gentleman came from actually Canada, near the Alberta tar sand pits, where it's one of the most polluting sources of shale oil. And he cannot drink the water in his home or shower with it. So he felt a kinship to the people at Standing Rock. So he came down to lend his support. And then there were amusing things that would happen at the protest. People would fall in love. The gentleman lived at Standing Rock, and one day he woke up and said, I think I should get married, probably. And I'm going to look for somebody that might fall in love with me. And 2 weeks later, that morning he met this woman, and from Michigan, I believe. And then they got married 2 weeks later in this Native American church ceremony. So there was instances of flare-ups, and then it would die down, standing against the forces of the state. So on this particular day, Native veterans came from all over the United States to lend their support to the protesters. And this blizzard just blew up on the march to the bridge, which had been blocking off access to where the pipeline was being constructed. At one point, there were 10,000 people camping out in support of this protest. There were native tribes from all over the world. The Sami came from, Scandinavia. There were people from Hawaii, Australia. It was a pretty amazing assembly. It was almost, it was kind of like Woodstock, but with, a definite, serious purpose. You can see on one of the trailers, campers says Mini Wakoni, which means water is life. And, it goes back to that first image that the Lakotas have a worldview of nature being so integral to their life, it's sacred. And a violation of that is a violation to their, sense of being. So that's why this protest was so important. So on one night of the flare-ups, they brought in water cannons in freezing temperatures, and militarized police from different states were brought in to control the situation. You can see the concertina wire. They were shooting rubber bullets and things like that, and spraying freezing water. Concussion grenades. So there were also people decided to impede the construction of the pipeline by attaching themselves to Caterpillar trailers, tractors, and excavators. So of course those people were arrested, arraigned in court, and you can see how the judicial system is playing out. Most of them just got misdemeanors, but a few were brought up on felony charges. Ironically, there's a little portrait of a Native American chief in the background. Yeah. Actually, my roommate, Cheryl Hatch, taught me to look for little details to add to your pictures like that. And that's Turtle Island, where beyond that is where they were drilling the drill pad. If you remember, if you followed the story, Obama had put a halt to the construction of the pipeline, and they had this drill pad beyond that concertina wire, like a mile out, and they were ready to dig under the river, and that was the final part of the pipeline that needed to be built. So on New Year's Eve, there were people who remained in the heart of winter, went up this hill and planted the flag as a sign of protest. And, in the early spring, the police, militarized police, was brought in to clear out the camps completely, to be razed. And so there was no way of covering this story from the angle of the authorities because they wouldn't let you get close. So I had to be with the protesters and run with the protesters and just hope that I wouldn't trip up and get arrested. But to me, this image is compelling for personal reasons, knowing the history of our American history of when or how Native American camps used to be raided by the cavalry and people were slaughtered. So, although no one was hurt, it harkens back to history. This was one of the leaders of the protest. And history circles back. This woman was very active in the Wounded Knee standoff in the 70s, where the National Guard was brought in. And here she was in her 80s, early 80s, she was making a stand for the water rights of her cousins up north at Standing Rock. So yeah, they were chasing protesters across the frozen river, and I was running with them. And this is one of the final scenes where she was a water healer, and she brought this ribbon that signified the black snake, which was the pipeline, and she was trying to sort of sanctify something that was so sacrilegious to the supporters of the Standing Rock people, members. So the lesson in this is that you just never know when a personal project can turn into a big headline, right? So you got to follow your passion. You have to follow the stories you feel are important to you. And at some point, if it matches up with the headlines, you have this expertise, a passion, and access to the story that few people have. And you're in a unique position to tell that story. So any questions about this particular story? And then I'm going to move on to, I should go, okay. Okay, next story I'm going to do is some images from the Rohingya exodus. And so what happened with this story is the same thing that happened when I heard about the Standing Rock protests. And I'm just fascinated with the idea of exodus because of my own immigration to this country, although it's totally nothing compared to what happened to the Rohingya. And I titled it Movement, Culture, People. And to me, it's what sounded like from Bob Marley's song, right? But it's not actually. It turned out I Googled it, and it's not exactly what he's saying. But it made sense to me in that respect. And so the history of humankind is a history of movement. And we've always been on the move looking for a better place to live, a more secure place to live, and a place where your culture can survive and thrive. So in the case of the previous story, the Native Americans were bounded into a very limited area, and they've tried to preserve their culture within those confines. Whereas before, they were able to follow the buffalo all over the plains, all over the Midwest, up into Canada. So it was a different exodus, almost an inward one. So with the Rohingyas, it's more of a traditional exodus where they were prosecuted in Myanmar, and they had no choice. They had to leave. So I made 2 trips, and this is on the first trip that I went there. And I was inspired by a friend of mine, Cheryl Diaz-Meyer, who went like a month before. And I had questioned her about, what happened, what did you see? And she filled me in. I did as much reading as I could so I would be prepared. She hooked me up with a translator. So I went in as prepared as I could. And it's a 2-day journey to get there. You have to, in my case, you had to go through the Middle East and then into Bangladesh and then get to the camps. So in this case, I'm opening with this image. It just shows the desperation. This is possibly some of the last wave of Rohingya who came out of Myanmar. And what had happened was people were fleeing by traditional boats, as you saw in the last presentation, or swimming across the river with buoys. But in the end, the Bangladesh government had banned boats quote-unquote, trafficking Rohingya into Bangladesh. So if you were caught bringing the Rohingya in boats, you would go to jail and your boat would be burned. So that kind of stopped for the most part. So in desperation, the Rohingya pictured here, they had been on the edge of the Naf River, which divides Myanmar and Bangladesh. And they'd been starving, they were running out of food, and they either had to cross or, who knows what would have happened. So they were very resourceful. They tied together oil cans, plastic jugs, bamboo, and rope, and made these floats to cross the river, which is really wide. It takes hours to cross. And most of the people here don't know how to swim, so it's very scary. And to get this picture, it was on the last few, because I hadn't come in the first wave of the Rohingya coming into Bangladesh, I wasn't sure I was able to capture this image that would tell the story of the Exodus in one image. So I worked with my translator. He got in touch. He's also a journalist in his own right, and a great one. And he got in touch with his sources, and they were able to get in touch with people on the Myanmar side. They communicated, and they told me that, I was able to find out that one morning, 5 or 8 rafts, I forget how many, would come over to Bangladesh. So we just waited there, and what's funny is that, when something like this happens, you think, oh my goodness, I'm going to be the only one there, and this is going to be great. But there are other great journalists working. They also know about this. So you're working side to side with them, and which is fine, and you try to accommodate each other, right? And you can see a lot of the refugees are children and women. So the Bangladesh army was brought in to kind of keep order, have people registered as they landed on shore in Teknaf and Shapuridip, which is about 2 hours south of Cox's Bazar, where I was staying. Actually, more closer to 2.5, I guess. Children were being carried in baskets. The heat is pretty stifling, even though this was not the peak heat. And you can see people are just coming with their bare possessions, really. It was just a really difficult journey. Just walking to the border of Myanmar and Bangladesh before crossing would take, for some of them, 7 to 10 days. So these people are waiting to be registered so they can actually have some shelter in the refugee camp. And then, as in the previous report, you found out about a lot of the atrocities that happened. This mother was looking after her son, who had been thrown into a live fire and to be burned alive. So he was recovering in a free hospital in Cox's Bazar, and they had a wing designated for the Rohingya. And this gentleman had been, his face had been hacked to pieces, parts of it. And so he was covered in scabs and bandages. And, I looked for him a few days later, but he must have been brought to a higher level, trauma level hospital, because he did not remain at this free hospital, which had, not to knock it, but did not have the greatest care, access to medicine and things like that. And then, of course, some of the victims are young girls. These are two sisters who escaped. They lost their parents. What happened was they were escaping the village, and the fathers, turned to the daughters and said, you can't just leave with just a few clothes you have. I'm going to go back in the house and grab some clothes for you. So he did, except the army caught up to him, and they barred all the doors and set the house on fire. So he was burned alive. And so as these two sisters escaped with their mother, they were tracked down by the army, and the mother was shot and died, in her tracks. And the girls were taken into custody and raped. But eventually, they were released, and they made their way to the border. They're at this, in this image, they're like 12 and 15. So this is what the camp looks like. It's since late, I believe about August 2017, there's over 700,000 Rohingya refugees who have arrived in the refugee camps. And it's just a tremendous influx, impact on the environment, and stressor on the localities. And, obviously there's little choice. It's either remain and die or escape. So the Bangladeshi government has been incredible in welcoming the refugees. And in conjunction with all the NGOs there that have helped out. And, part of this transformation is the impact on the environment. So I went to the outer edges of the refugee camp, where they're building these new camps that were less prone to flooding. So they raised it, and they were, taking down the hillsides and brush areas. And this is land that elephants would roam in their migration patterns from Bangladesh to Myanmar. So it has had a tremendous impact on the local wildlife. So there have been instances of Rohingya being killed by stampeding or traveling elephants that wandered into the village, where that used to be their traditional routes. So this is all the last three images are part of my second trip. So I went right before the monsoon, thinking I would catch the beginning of the monsoon, and I would document people preparing for the monsoon, because there had been dire predictions that the monsoon would cause tremendous mudslides in the villages, and people would die, and it would be just a disaster. And not that I was hoping for that, but if it were to happen, I want to be there to document it. And to the credit of the refugees there, they worked together with NGOs and took agency of their own future by building new roads, securing, hillsides that would be prone to mudslides, and reinforcing their shelters with these bamboo strips that would prevent the strong winds of destroying them. So you can see like these massive roads were built through the camps to facilitate transportation. But in water deluge, you can see how the housing on the lower part would be prone to a disaster. But these workers, mostly Rohingya, or all of them, worked to reinforce the roads, and this just happened throughout the camps, just everywhere. Water wells were drilled because there's such a tremendous impact on the resources, especially the water table. Water wells had to be dug constantly. And this is being done by the Rohingya people. So on the second trip, one of the things I want to document is that aside of refugee coverage that you don't often see is the agency that people have that of their own faith and their sense of pride and safekeeping of themselves as individuals. So refugees are not just victims, and it's important to document that. And one of the things that was mentioned was a question in the previous lecture was, was there any help from other Muslim countries? And this was food distribution by a Turkish agency, where they serve hot meals twice a day. And once you realize that the rations you get are, 2 big bags of rice a month and cooking oil and some minor things, you realize that it's not really a sustainable diet. And when someone cooks 2 meals a day, like curry chicken, it's such a luxury that people really line up and wait for hours, try and get food and bring it back to their family. I try to document some of the daily life going on in the camps, in the little madrasas where children were studying Arabic and math and things like that. And the little stories within the big picture. This gentleman lost his leg as he was escaping Myanmar, and he made it to the camps, but because his leg was so infected, they had to amputate it. So, he was a proud farmer in Myanmar, had his own rice fields, raised his family, and now it'd be really difficult for him to farm if he went back to Myanmar, which he wanted to do if the situation allowed. So what he would do, he'd go to the mosque nearby with his crutches and pray. And this is how he would get around the camp. It was difficult, and I was just wondering, if there would be a prosthetic available for him. And so I'll come back to that. So what happened also, as the refugees came and settled there, babies were born, over 20,000 in 2018. And so if you wanted rations, you have to register your child and get a ration card. Otherwise, they would come out of your own rations. So they waited for hours, these mothers. So the tragedy continues in the camps because of the intense impact of putting over 1 million people in a very tiny area. So this gentleman was just walking down the main street, and a truck kind of swerved into him and ran over his leg. So he didn't lose his leg in Myanmar, but he lost his leg, living in the refugee camp. And this is a tent hospital there. And it's the closest hospital to the refugee camps. It's run by the Crescent, European Crescent, Red Cross. And he would probably have died if that hospital wasn't there, because it takes over an hour to go back to Cox's Bazar to go to a proper hospital, one inside a building. So because of the services of the NGO, prosthetic would be eventually available to him, which is good, obviously. And then because the camps are so huge, the previous gentleman didn't even know that this service was available. So I kind of relayed that information to him. And so that was one of the positives of this trip, is little things like that. And you can see the reinforced shelters with the bags of sand to prevent slides. Her husband is still in Myanmar and hasn't been able to come over. There were slices of daily life in the camps that kind of brought a smile to your face. There was like a dress vendor who would walk around with $5 dresses, and it was just incredible. Like little things like that would bring so much joy to the children there. And then I was able to capture a little bit of the monsoon, and it came, and I don't think it stopped for a while. So, but it's one of the things you can't time anymore, predictably, because of global warming. So, and that's that.
We have a few minutes for questions. There's one right here. Mike's coming to you.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how it was going from a place like Pine Ridge, where you spent 3 years getting to know the community, and then going and working with a translator and just maybe not knowing as much because you're there for less time. And then also how using a translator affected your process.
Yeah, it was, luckily I had a translator who was also a journalist. So you want someone who kind of understands your language and your process and is after the same things you are. And he's really smart. So, and we had a connection, just as individuals. So we worked really well together. Obviously, it's easier to communicate with someone who speaks your own language. But at the end of the day, we're just all humans. And I always try to connect with people either here or abroad with a lot of non-verbal cues. I was, touching someone on their shoulder or establish eye contact that's very friendly. And not try to dominate situations just coming in as a bull in a china shop, so to speak. So yeah, it's definitely more difficult, but it's still possible to do that.
For your Exodus story, was that another passion project on your own, or did you apply for a grant to go over there?
Yeah, like for Standing Rock, and for like Pine Ridge, I got a couple grants to do that. And then for Standing Rock, even though I was technically a freelancer to my paper, they paid back my time and expenses. And then for the Rohingya, I would use, I submitted it to a wire service, so they would pay most of my expenses for that. So to me, these are just like chapters. Like if I were going to do a book, I would just do one book at the end of my career about, just migration and exodus. So these are just like chapters in that. And that's the way I look at it. So.
I want to say thank you so much for being here and sharing your work. Your photos are very moving and very thought-provoking. My question would be, I guess with young photojournalists today, there's a lot of issues of finding funding to do passion projects or even dealing with burnout. You mentioned yourself that you went into wedding photography in order to make money, but do you have any tips or suggestions for young photojournalists today in order to combat that?
Yeah, I think if you follow your heart and you follow the subjects that you have a connection with and that you're passionate about telling stories about, you'll do a good job. And because sometimes your time is not technically compensated, so you want to invest your whole being in it. And there's always grants out there. They're tough to get, but once in a while you'll get one. Because there's so many great photographers out there. You're not going to win all the grants, So, and also, even the best photographers, like Mary Calvert, who has incredible project on wounded warriors, female warriors. She does corporate work, and, it's, unless you Sebastian Salgado, where you can sell a print for $10,000, it's hard to fund your projects with exclusively out of your projects. You know what I'm saying? So, but you gotta try. You gotta look for ways. You gotta be resourceful. So.
Could you talk about your choice not to use color, and what is the situation on the XL pipeline now?
Oh, the DAPL, yeah. Dakota Access Pipeline. I think the Excel, it might be a different one, but right now the pipeline is somewhat stable, but if at any time you could have a mass rupture, a bad incident. So what was the other question? I'm sorry.
Black and white.
Oh, why do I do black and white? Well, I guess I'm old school. I really enjoy black and white photography. When I got into photography, all my heroes were the old school guys, Eugene Smith, and women, Margaret Bourke-White and Dorothea Lange, Imogen Cunningham. And I just love black and white because I love color too, but I found that color has very limited time in the day where you can do good work, so to speak, because if you shoot color in midday, it's hard to control the highlights. And I've found I've been able to get decent images in black and white throughout the day. So I also like the simplicity of black and white. It just speaks to me on an emotional level.
Thank you so much for being
Oh,
here.
thanks.
You're out of town.
Thank you.